This video is part 4 of Chapter 9, Social Psychology, for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. In this part of the chapter, we're going to look at a variety of different types of group influence, specifically social facilitation, social loafing and the diffusion of responsibility, the bystander effect, de-individuation, and group polarization. The thread that kind of links these concepts together is that they all involve the presence of other people and the fact of their being present influencing the nature of our performance of various tasks, whether it's really super simple tasks or difficult tasks or group decision-making tasks or decisions to provide assistance and help. The presence of other people matters and can influence what we do, when we do it, how fast we do it, etc. So we're going to start with social facilitation. And social facilitation tasks, it always kind of amuses me because my first introduction to research on social facilitation was in the social psychology class that I took in college from Dr. Heingartner at Ohio Wesleyan. And at first I thought he was kidding because he described a researcher who used as his subjects in the research not people, not primates, not even dogs and cats, but cockroaches. And I thought, who studies social behavior in cockroaches? But apparently this guy did. Basically, here's how he set it up. Cockroaches don't like being in the light. So if you turn on a bright light and you happen to have cockroaches around, they're going to run really fast to find darkness. So he set up this little, basically, racetrack for cockroaches where they start in a dark box, and there's a little track, and then there's another dark box at the other end of the track. And they would turn a bright light on in their start box, and they would start scurrying, which is what a lot of bugs do. And they would run down the track to get into the dark box, and they would be timed. How fast did the cockroaches run? And they would time it when they were by themselves first, and then later they would have these little audience boxes like loges at a big arena, have these little audience boxes, and in the little audience boxes were other little cockroaches and there were little holes that were not big enough for the audience cockroaches to get through, but their presence was known to the runner cockroach. So when there were audience cockroaches present, the cockroaches actually ran faster. Bizarre. But there you have it. Even in the simplest of creatures, the presence of an audience can actually increase your performance, but only if the task is easy or well learned. So the technical definition of social facilitation is the facilitation of the dominant response on a task due to the presence of other people causing arousal. So what do they mean by dominant response? What they're talking about broadly is either success or failure, fast or slow, depending on the nature of the task. If you have a simple task or a really well-learned task, having other people present is likely to increase your level of arousal, and you will use that as an energizing source. So the presence of others is going to make your task better or your performance better. If it's a difficult task or it's new and you don't know how to do it yet, so you're not well practiced, having other people around makes it more likely for you to slow down, to make more mistakes, and perform more poorly. So why this happens is primarily because just the simple presence of other people being around you is arousing. It causes physiological arousal, it increases your heart rate, and all of those other things that are associated with autonomic nervous system arousal. Now, if it's a really easy task or well-learned task, having that extra energy can be a good thing. If it's a difficult task or not well learned, that extra energy coming from arousal can actually divide your attention and interfere with doing a good job. Now, social loafing is kind of the opposite. Now, a lot of times when I present this idea, students automatically go to situations like horrible group projects that they've had to do in school. That's not exactly what the researchers were looking at when they talked about social loafing, though. Because, when you're in a group project with other students, you know how much you're putting in. You have individual contributions. You know how much other people are putting in, etc. You're often performing subtasks, and that's really not what was being looked at in social loafing research. Here's the classic version of the research, and it was done in a lot of different ways, but here's one. You're a participant, you show up at the study, and you come into the laboratory, into a tiny room. You sit down, in front of you is a microphone, and you're told, to shout into the microphone when the signal light comes on. Shout into the microphone as loudly as you can. We're going to measure how loud your voice is. Who knows what the backstory was, but that was the task. Pretty easy task. Now, if they're measured alone, you get kind of a baseline level of loudness. Then they're told there are a bunch of other rooms just like this one, and there's another subject in each of the rooms. When the signal light goes off, we want you to shout as loudly as you can. We're going to combine everybody's shouting and get a group number of loudness. So when people are told they are working on the same task together, and there's no way to individually identify their unique contribution, their performance tends to degrade the more people they believe are participating with them. So the larger the group, the less likely that the social loafing will be detected. Now, you may jump to the conclusion that people are being intentionally lazy. That's not necessarily the case. When we perceive that there's diffused responsibility, we may not know that we're putting out less effort, but we do put out less effort under those circumstances. Now, there is an impact of difficulty of task, though. When the task is easy or well learned, that's when you see that diminishment of effort the most obviously. When the task is hard and everybody's working together on a very hard task, we tend not to see the same kind of social loafing, primarily because the presence of those other people working on this super hard task, this unlearned task, tends to eliminate some of the worry we have of looking foolish or incompetent because our individual performance can't be identified as well. So just like with social facilitation, the difficulty of the task matters in terms of the impact. There is a tendency for diffusion of responsibility in group tasks where your individual performance can't be separated out. And part of it is because of a lack of individual accountability. But another part of it is just sort of this perceptual impact of having other people co-acting with you at the same time. It kind of diffuses down. You have less arousal, less perception of your individual performance being scrutinized by other people. The bystander effect, some of the original research was motivated by some notorious examples of failures to intervene in emergency situations. Your authors talk about the horrible case of the murder of Kitty Genovese, who, and if you're interested in this story, there are some really great documentaries out there that give you much more in-depth information than what was made public at the time. Basically, Kitty Genovese was a young woman who was assaulted and eventually murdered in the courtyard area of her apartment building. What was reported in the press was that there were lots of people in the apartment complex who witnessed her murder but didn't intervene. The truth is it was a lot more complicated than that. Newspapers tended to argue that this was a situation of urban callousness, that these were people who were faced with this emergency and they just didn't care enough to intervene. That's really not what happened. And people like Darley and Latine wanted to show that emergency situations where people need help are just like any other social situation. There are lots of social factors about the context that are going to determine whether or not and how fast and what kind of assistance people are going to give. And what they found through lots of really clever research was that the more people who are around in the context of an emergency, the slower and the less likely help is to be rendered, largely because of the impact of other people being present has a number of very predictable effects on people's decision making. Through their research, they produced a model, a decision-making model for bystander intervention. Now, let me describe a classic version of the research done in this area. You have a subway car in a big city. Let's say you're the researcher. You're going to be off to the side so that you can observe. And you're going to document things like how many people are on the subway. And then you have your actor. You have an actor come in and they are walking to their seat and they collapse in an apparent medical emergency. What you're looking for as the researcher, you want to know how long it takes for someone to approach the victim and start to render assistance. How many other people are present? What kind of assistance is rendered, if any? What they determined was that at every step in the process, the presence of extra people slows us down. So stage one is, first you have to notice that there's an emergency in the first place. When people are distracted, when they're in a hurry, when there's a lot of people around, that interferes with our ability to notice that anybody needs help. The second stage is appropriately interpreting the event as an emergency. So, for example, if you have lots of people on the subway car, the actor collapses into the aisleway in an apparent medical emergency. Immediately, people start to scan their surroundings, looking at other people's behaviors, because this is the essence of an ambiguous situation. You may say, oh, that looks like a person in a medical emergency. And you look at other people around you. If they're not acting, if they look totally calm and they're ignoring it, you're likely to interpret that as a non-emergency based on the behavior of other people. So this is an informational social influence effect called pluralistic ignorance, where you're misinterpreting what's going on because of the inaction of other people being present. If nobody else is there, you're the only ones whose behavior you have to interpret. You look at the situation, you quickly size it up, you intervene. At the third stage is the need to assume responsibility. And here, the presence of other people can interfere because that responsibility is spread out across the group. If you don't know these people, and, subway car, mass transit, you don't know the people you're riding with, and the victim is somebody you don't know either. Having that diffused responsibility slows us down and encourages us to just basically assume somebody else is going to take care of it, and it's not your job. The fourth stage is, let's say you've assumed, you're like, it's on me. Then you start to question yourself. Do I know what kind of assistance to give? Am I competent? Am I capable? Like, there's some kinds of helping type situations where you're like, I am the worst person. Maybe this person has collapsed in the aisleway. They appear to be having a heart attack. if you know that you don't know CPR, you don't know any sort of emergency medical, have any medical training, you're like, I am the last person to help. If somebody has a broken down car, I am definitely the last person who can be helpful to them, unless all they need is a phone call. I don't know anything about cars. I am useless in that situation. So at that point, it's more about you kind of sizing yourself up. Other people being around encourages us to believe that those other people have more skills than we do. So it slows us down. Then you have to actually implement your decision. So let's say that you've decided, yeah, I can do it. I can give some help here. I can be helpful. Then the presence of other people still can get in your way because you might worry, but what if I screw up? What if I don't do it very well? Maybe I'll get in trouble. Maybe I'll get hurt. Then you start to kind of, in the context of other people watching you, helping people in an emergency is a hard task. You may slow down your decision making to actually start helping if you feel like other people may judge you. They may not see you as being the best person to do it, whatever. You may even think you'll get into trouble or you'll get sued. Maybe you have legal concerns. All of that stuff can be magnified when you have other people present. So basically what these researchers were showing was even in the horrific situation of Kitty Genovese's murder, there are a lot of social and cognitive factors in play in getting people to the point where they would leave their apartments, go outside, and intervene during this very difficult situation. So, for example, when people were actually interviewed after the murder, there were people who called the police and waited. There were people who looked at the situation, assumed that other people had called the police. So right there, there was a diffusion of responsibility. Some people reported that they looked at the scene and they didn't think that what was happening was a murderous assault. They thought it was a couple having an argument. And the fact that nobody else appeared to be running to break up the fight led to pluralistic ignorance, misinterpreting the event as a non-emergency and a private matter between two people. Other interviewees said, this looked like a dangerous situation. I'm an old person. I'm not capable of breaking up a fight. I was afraid of getting hurt. That diffusion of responsibility and lack of feeling competent to intervene was problematic for some of the witnesses, and it slowed them down. Some people felt that there were others who were more competent, and even if they believed they needed to do something to help, by the time they were implementing the decision, sadly, the victim died. And then there was this quirky element to the murder itself where the perpetrator was interrupted, left, then came back. So in some cases, the witnesses saw the first part, thought it was over, went on about their business, didn't see the second part of the attack. So there were lots of possibilities for interfering with any individual, going downstairs, going outside, and then intervening at a time which could have saved her life. De-individuation is another one of these group context impacts that you're probably familiar with. I'm going to show you a video. He's going to describe a classic study. It's a weird study, but classic nonetheless. And then I'll talk about it.
In the 1970s, psychologists ran an experiment on more than 1,000 trick-or-treaters in Seattle. They wanted to know how likely they would be to steal candy or money, even when an adult told them explicitly not to. In particular, they were interested in something called de-individuation, which is what happens when we lose a sense of our personal identity. Anytime we happen to have this experience and we lose a sense of ourselves and a sense of personal responsibility, we might end up doing things that we wouldn't ordinarily do. A common example of this is riots, which is what happens when people lose a sense of themselves and they get caught up in a group mind and end up flipping cars and eating fast food cheesy fries. Things you wouldn't ordinarily do on your own. Halloween is a perfect example of de-individuation, because after all, you're wearing a costume, and when you wear a costume, you're not you, you're more tacky representation of a vampire. And anytime you don't feel like yourself, you might feel more free to behave badly. In this Halloween experiment, whenever kids would get up to the door, an adult would answer and say, "Oh, happy Halloween, I have to keep working in the other room, but you can take one piece of candy." And sitting there on the table was a big bowl of candy, and next to it was a bowl of money for some reason or another. The question was, would kids follow the rules and just take one piece of candy, or would they stuff their hollow pumpkins with as much candy and money as their little hands could hold and run mischievously to the next house? The answer to that depended on two things. First, it depended on whether the kids arrived alone to the house or in a group. When kids arrived in a group, de-individuation was a little more likely, because you could blend in with the group, lose a sense of yourself, you've got a mask on, there's kids around you, you can't be held responsible. And that's in fact what they found. Compared to kids who came to the door alone, kids who came in groups were more likely to break the rules and take more than a piece of candy. The second thing it depended on was whether kids had to identify themselves when they went to the house. In some of the cases, the adult would ask the trick-or-treaters for their name and where they lived in the neighborhood. It sounds a little creepy, but it was just under the guise of a friendly neighborhood conversation. For kids who had to identify themselves from the beginning, they were less likely to break the rules and take more than a piece of candy, whereas the kids who got to keep themselves anonymous were way more likely to defy those rules. When you put these two things together, you see a pretty clear picture. In the most individuated condition, where kids came to the door alone and gave their name, only 7.5% of kids broke the rules and took more than they were allowed to. But compare that to the other group, the more extreme group where people were the most de-individuated, they came in a group and got to keep their anonymity. In that group, more than 57% of kids broke the rules that the adults set for them. So together we see a common picture of psychology and what de-individuation means. When we have to be identified, we have to live up to standards that we set for ourselves and act according to our principles and what people expect us to do. But when we get to lose our sense of identity, be anonymous and blend in with a group, we suddenly feel freer to break the rules when we might otherwise not. Alright, that does it for this installment of Halloween Psychology. This is the first in a 3-part series of videos on research and psychology that has to do with Halloween.
So that's a good example of a piece of research looking at a de-individuation effect in a naturalistic environment. You'd be surprised how many Halloween studies there have been. Quite a few, actually. They're hard to do, and they're hard to do ethically. But the one that was described there shows pretty common de-individuation effect, where you are manipulating the degree to which individual identity is clear, and it was shown that the more individual identity is made salient to the person who's responding, the more likely they are to behave in a way that is consistent with their own personal moral code, and the more likely they are to obey rules that have been imposed by other people. An interesting sideline, since the advent of doorbell cameras, de-individuation effects, like if you leave your Halloween candy on your porch, people with cameras tend to report far less breaking of candy rules. Like if you leave a sign that says take 2 pieces of candy, if there's a camera present, there's way less violation of those rules. The least violation of rules is when parents are present and kids are not on their own. the greatest violation of the rules is when there's a full mask costume, and when kids are in groups and they're all masked, then you see far more violation of rules. And all of these are de-individuation effects. The presence of a camera makes it more likely you're going to be personally identified, so that increases the likelihood that you get punished for what you're planning on doing. All of those are de-individuation effects. Now, there are lots of other examples I'm sure you can come up with. If you've gone to a concert, if you've gone to a big sporting event, when you are embedded in a crowd and you're dressed like everyone else in the crowd. So big sporting events are classic examples of this. People put on their jerseys and maybe they have other kinds of tools of fandom present. It's really easy to get de-individuated in that crowd and shout things, sing things, jump up and down, do all kinds of bizarre things just because everybody else is doing it, and nobody can identify you while you're at it. Finally, group polarization. And this is a concept that the students have told me is hard for them to get their heads around. So group polarization is an effect that involves, the technical definition is strengthening a group's typical stance on a topic or an issue after they discuss it. So let's say you're in a group of people and you're talking politics, and you're already a group that is pretty like-minded, so you have similar beliefs. After those individuals come together and they talk about topics related to politics together, their attitudes will become even more extreme. So if you have a group of liberal politically leaning people in a room and they talk about their issues, the issues that they care about, the individuals in that group are going to experience an effect that makes their attitude stronger as a result of talking with one another about the same topic. So their political opinions will become even more extreme when they talk together. So you have a bunch of conservative people with conservative values and beliefs. They're in a room, they're talking about their topics. They're going to come out being even more conservative than when they came into that discussion. That's called group polarization. This is typical in very specific kinds of contexts. So these are more structured, sort of task-related group discussion situations, like when it's committees or task groups. They tend to become more extreme with time as they discuss the things that they're doing. The most common type of research task that people are given for research on group polarization is something that involves making risky decisions. So if you have a group of people who are kind of biased in the direction of taking risks, and they talk about they're making a decision as a group, if the group members were already tolerant of risk, as a group, they're going to make an even riskier decision that they as individuals would have made. If they were a group of individuals who are already averse to risk, they didn't like taking risks, when they get together and they talk about making the decision, they're going to make an even more conservative decision, a less risky decision that they would have as individuals. So this means that their initial views are going to become even more polarized after they talk it through. Now you can see kind of the ramifications for politics here, especially in our current situation, because both informational and normative social influence are in play. You know, you come into your group of relatively like-minded people. The norms of the group are to agree, not to disagree. If you if you play devil's advocate and try and throw out alternative solutions, you risk being basically thrown out of the group. there's also some informational components. If you're confused, if you're less sure, you're going to listen to what people are saying, and it's going to strengthen your attitudes about the information that's being discussed. Now, groupthink is a specific outgrowth of group polarization. Actually, group polarization is a symptom that can show up in groupthink situations. Groupthink is a concept that grew out of some really notoriously bad decisions made at the government level. One of them was during the John F. Kennedy administration, where there was a decision made. It was a bad decision to take forces. It was called the Bay of Pigs debacle. I'm not going to go into the details, but it was a super bad decision. And kind of the run-up to making the decision showed some real problems in the way this presidential administration was talking through and then making decisions. The president will come in, sit down, and say, here's what I want to do, discuss. He was very charismatic, very in control. He made it very clear what he wanted to have happen. And the group, the cabinet, they tended to be like-minded, but there were also people in the group who really pushed the message that group harmony within this group matters a great deal. If you disagree with the president, you're in big trouble, and you're going to have consequences as a result. So groupthink came out of situations like that, where you have a really powerful leader, you have a leader that's transparent about what they think should happen, you have certain people in the group who are basically enforcers. They keep control of the message. If people are disagreeing, they're going to pull them back in line or get rid of them. Some of the symptoms, the primary symptom of groupthink in an organization making decisions is when the primary concern is to keep consensus in the group. So when that is the big driver, is maintaining consensus around a directive leader, that can lead to really disastrous outcomes, because the members of the group are going to put pressure on each other, and in some cases there will be one member of the group who is his or her entire purpose is to pressure the other group members to toe the line. Pressure is going to be put on the members to go along with the group's view, especially if the leader signals what they want the group's view to be. They're going to discourage bringing in external information. They're going to ignore and disagree and refute any kind of counter information. That means that external information is going to be suppressed, and it will bolster. So here comes group polarization. Since you aren't allowing any external information to come in, you're having just a like-minded group that's only going to say what the leader wants to hear. It creates an illusion of unanimity, and that means nobody's going to question. Even if they internally say this is a disaster, they're afraid to say anything about it because of normative social influence. They're worried about the consequences of being punished or thrown out. And they may, in fact, believe, yes, this is exactly the right decision because it just feels right and nobody's disagreeing anyway. So groupthink leads to this sort of illusion of infallibility, that the belief that the group itself is incapable of making mistakes. So how do you get rid of groupthink? Well, basically, if you're a leader and you don't want your group to make bad decisions, you need to refrain from stating an opinion about what you think the outcome should be. You also need to set your group up such that you have outside opinions intentionally brought forward. You have to task people on your group to look for alternative explanations, look for alternative solutions. You have to appoint people who will take that role of challenging the decisions that are being made, looking for alternatives, looking for pitfalls and problems. You have to make group harmony less important than good decision making, and that can eliminate groupthink outcomes. And that concludes this section.